I'm sure many of the things that our presenters will talk about will very much resonate with some of the issues raised in the morning panel, as well as with what President Boric talked about in his presentation. So this is a panel full of continental expertise on the part of UCLA. We have scholars from various schools and departments. And basically what we're going to do is we are going to bring many of the themes and discussions and issues that were raised throughout the day to earth, very much to the ground, and see how things are seen and experienced by different populations in different domains, in different spheres of life, and across many different countries, from North America all the way to the Southern Cone. So the dynamics of the panel, the structure of the panel is basically the following. I'm going to do very quick introductions of my colleagues here, and I will ask them to give very short presentations, because as you can see, we have multiple presenters here of 5 minutes each. Those presentations, needless to say, reflect or will be based on the expertise of the particular scholar. And based on that, we'll have a round of discussion. The idea is to have this as much as a conversation as possible, and avoid very sort of lengthy speeches, I guess. So we should start with we'll start with the order of the program, if I have it correctly here, with to my left, Susanna Hecht, who's director of the UCLA Center for Brazilian Studies, which is part of the UCLA Latin American Institute. She's also professor of urban planning at the UCLA Luskin School. Dr. Hecht research focuses on political ecology, but her results have major implications for climate change adaptation, a huge issue, of course, nowadays, mitigation and long-term rethinking of the longer-term resilience and strategies for societies. So, Susanna, you have your 5 minutes.
Okay, yes, my 5 minutes of fame here. I have my watch. I can just watch it. So I'm actually a specialist on Amazonia, which often makes it sound like I was sort of like a niche scholar or something, except this involves 9 Latin and South American states. And because of the importance of Amazonia in global hydrology, but also very specifically in Latin American and South American hydrology, the water from the Amazon is breathed up into the atmosphere. It goes to the Andes, so it affects the watersheds there. It affects the water supplies on the Andean countries. And because of the atmospheric rivers, it also has a huge effect on the Southern Cone. So Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay. So the point is that all of South America is Amazonian, in my opinion. And I know that this might not be a view widely shared, but in any case, on the basis of hydrology and atmospheric flows, that is the case. Amazonia is of US size. It's important right now because it's sitting on a climate tipping point that's going to have a lot of ramifications. So rather than go into a long discursive thing on Amazonia, which I could certainly do for many hours, what I'd like to do, particularly in light of Mr. Boric's discussion, is to talk a little bit about a moment in which there was a rethinking of a constitution from the authoritarian regime into the democratic regime, and then sort of coming full circle back to authoritarianism and militarism, and what this means, and what this means environmentally. I'm surprised we didn't have more environmental discussion, but that's perhaps because I spend all my time in environmental meetings. But I would make one point by the work of James Boyce, and I'm always tempted to say James Joyce, who basically is an economic ecologist, and who always makes the argument that democracies have better have better environmental outcomes because of the natures of participation than authoritarian regimes because of the nature of their, in many ways, coterie corruption. So let me just take you back to 1988, just really quickly. We had the end of the authoritarian period, in part triggered by a lot of social movements, environmental movements around Amazonia and around labor movements in the south of Brazil, in the industrial south, that acted kind of like Chernobyl for the Brazilian authoritarian state. It really highlighted its problems. In the subsequent period, what happened in the Constitution building was widespread participation by social movements, indigenous groups, Afro-descendant groups, women, a whole reconstruction of a constitution with a very strong environmental as well as social dimensions, and not just thinking that people had rights to democracy, but also had rights to a decent environment. So it's important to keep that in mind, that is a key element in this story. It included diversity, as I mentioned, strong environmental language, and it really resulted in a lot of consolidation of new kinds of environmental and social institutions, a wide-ranging set and dynamic set of legislation, and many things associated with what we might call the three greens: green markets, green environmentalism, and green governance, and this became very important. What is important to realize is, while you see those graphs, and I was not permitted to show slides, it has to be said, but I have great slides that show this very specifically. But you could really see between the different more authoritarian regimes and more democratic regimes, changes in deforestation, which I'm sort of using as a proxy for democracy and social participation. And I can prove this to you, but not in the time I have. But the real big point here is that between 2004 and 2014, a period of great democratization, more participation, a lot of environmental institutions were elaborated, legislation, and so on. You had a drop in deforestation in that decade, 2004 to 14, of 80%. So the point here really speaks to Boyce's idea that democracies have really much better outcomes. And this also was associated with better incomes and other kinds of things. However, and I was thinking about this vis-a-vis, and I'm getting the eye here, vis-a-vis Mr. Borges' talk, because I have 1 minute, because in essence, the coterie that was expanding at this time, the agro-industrial and extractive coterie, found itself also organizing at the same time. By 2016, you have an institutional takeover, and then what you have is the election of Jair Bolsonaro and the return to both militarization of the regime and also a complete undermining of environmental institutions, the militarization of the cabinet. Amazonian management is placed under military question, and essentially you get amnesty for basically environmental crimes. You also, because the economy starts to fail, you get an explosion in clandestine economies of gold, timber, land grabbing, and and coca. So what you have also at this time is a great deal of destabilization under this more militaristic situation and increasing threats of not recognizing the new, the soon-to-be election in the fall and threats of a coup. So what does this get us to? And of course, I could go on for hours on this in much more detail, but I'm afraid that I can't do that. First of all, there has been a response to this, particularly in the part of indigenous populations, Afro-descendant populations, defending their rights and demanding their citizenship, which has been sort of overlooked under the regime. The other thing is that these defenders are sort of the front lines that we see, and we heard mentioned that indigenous groups and human rights defenders, mostly environmentalists, is about the most dangerous job you can have. So finally, the question I have right now is that, first of all, just because not everything is irreversible. So even these damages may not be able to be fully recuperated, particularly the ecological ones. The political schisms make it very difficult to redo the institutional and legislative things. And macro politics and macroeconomics, such as Ukraine, basically are going to be reinforcing deforestation economies and that particular coterie, as well as what I like to call Saudi Amazonia, which is, there's much more oil produced in Amazonia than perhaps you realize. So the question is really, to put it in the words of my favorite author, Brazilian author, Euclides da Cunha, he argued that that Amazonia was the last unfinished page of Genesis. And so the big question I think that remains and still is to be written is what's going to be on that page. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Susanna. Thank you. Next, we have Professor Veronica Herrera to my right. She's Associate Professor of Urban Planning at the UCLA Luskin School. Veronica studies the politics of development in global South cities with a focus on Latin America. Welcome, Veronica.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I also wanted to say a few words today about the role of environmental movements in Latin America, particularly as a space for the exercise of democracy and the development of political institutions. And that's where my research has been, and also been focusing more on these topics in my teaching. So as we know, as you've been hearing, environmental degradation is an extensive problem everywhere in Latin America. You have a dramatic rise in the number of socio-environmental conflicts. For example, the ombudsman's office in Peru notes that 80% of their social conflicts are socio-environmental conflicts, right? And that's just one example. So you've got conflicts surrounding mining, hydroelectric dam developments, mega development projects, and also different problems that we see in cities with respect to maybe not the same level of socio-environmental conflict, but water, air degradation. So in my research on environmental advocacy movements surrounding river pollution, I have a project on the mobilization of communities surrounding river pollution in Buenos Aires, Bogota, and Lima, because I'm not sure if you're aware, but only about 85% of the global wastewater is untreated. So we only have about 15% of treatment of wastewater globally. So this is a big problem. And most of our rivers in Latin America are biologically dead. And so this is a big problem. And what I've been seeing is how citizen participation has been critical to creating environmental regulations, and in some cases, more capacity for more enforcement. And without the mobilization of communities, there would really be no regulations and no environmental protections that are being enforced. So it's kind of, it's really an interesting space for thinking about what does democracy look like and how is it making strides in areas that maybe are understudied or underappreciated when we think about democratic institutions. So what's going on? Grassroots movements are using familiar tools of protests, of course, such as street politics, marches, roadblocks, rallies, but also, interestingly, new forms of working within institutions within government, such as the judiciary, the ombudsman's office, the comptroller's office, to align with change makers within government. So there's been some really interesting things going on. Community activists are engaging a wide range of participatory mechanisms, for example, litigation strategies, acciones populares, which are claims regarding violation of collective rights, amparos, constitutional protection lawsuits, tutelas, constitutional injunctions. In both Colombia and Argentina, Supreme Courts have ruled in favor of claimants bringing cases against the right to a clean environment and to clean up these rivers that, of course, are in the capital cities of these two countries. And they've created judicial advisory committees to oversee the carrying out of these rulings. And the key people on these judicial advisory committees are the grassroots movements, are the local NGOs, and activists who have expertise and experience working on these issues. In Colombia, the Comptroller's Office has helped create citizen watchdog groups. They're called veedores, that help document the misuse of public infrastructure funds in local communities. And they document on their own, and they work with environmental prosecutors to help boost cases of environmental regulatory infractions. So, spaces for institutionalized participation are hard fought. They're not a panacea, and they have to be supported with political will and material resources. Oftentimes, political will falls short, or public officials support activists in one forum and then block them in another, right? So those are some of the challenges. But I just want to stress that without pushes from organized civil society, very little environmental regulations really are occurring. And this is across a wide range of sectors. This is not just in river pollution. So I want to just kind of put out there that many social movements we're seeing today in Latin America are actually regulatory movements, where they're not the ideological movements that we saw before to the same extent, in that they're really pushing the state for more accountability and compliance with their mandated responsibilities to provide environmental protections, but also public services and increase social welfare. So to this point that was brought up in the beginning, the first talk about, are we talking about democratic institutions, or should we be talking about governance and the ability to deliver on public services? Well, look at the people, and what are they saying? So many of the movements that we see are about accountability movement for the state to do its job and function. And people are taking it to the streets, but they're also taking it to the courts, and they're taking it to lots of different forums to demand that the state comply with their obligations. Let me just say a couple more things. I know I'm going to run out of time. It's interesting also to think about the connection with human rights. So, for example, in Buenos Aires, the Matanza-Riachuelo River pollution case, environmentalists have teamed up with human rights activists. And this is really a big thing that's happened in many spaces where environmental activists are reframing the problem of environmental injustice as a human rights injustice. And that's where they've been able to get more traction and more eyes on the problem, and connect to a very strong, vibrant human rights movement in Argentina that has created institutions such as the Ombudsman's Office and many other institutions for the last 20 or so years. So I just want to end by saying, as Dr. Hecht was saying, that as you know, being an environmentalist is very dangerous in Latin America. Colombia was the deadliest country for environmental activism in 2020, right? Mexico was right behind. And really, this is something I think was not talked about today, and I feel like I need to just emphasize it, is that the level of violence surrounding environmentalism reflects a broader corruption in society and in our politics, between the collusion between mega development projects or real estate development, Oberdect and the construction companies, and local political officials. If you look at the mining companies, it's a revolving door between the local elected officials that serve for a few years as a local elected official, and then go and serve as the president of that branch of the mining company. It's really something that that's what these environmental activists are up against. And so it would be important to remember that the challenge is phenomenal. But basically, I just want to end by saying that when the environmental movements are on the front lines to defend the environment, they're not just doing so to help protect the environment, but also, and their right to access a clean environment and their livelihoods, but also really, as Dr. Hecht was suggesting, their right to participate in the democratic process and craft an environmental justice movement that privileges inclusion, participation, and citizen power. And I think that if we are going to see any regulations around these important issues, it is really only through people power. And that's what I'm finding in my research. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. We have next Professor Paavo Monkkonen. He's Associate Professor of Urban Planning and Public Policy at the UCLA Luskin School. He's also the director of the Latin American Cities Initiative and faculty cluster leader for the Global Public Affairs Initiative. He researches and writes on the ways policies and markets shape urbanization and social segregation in cities around the world. Paavo, take it away.
Thank you. Yes, that's what I research and write. Thanks for being here still. Good to see you all. It's so fun to be on this panel with my colleagues. It's really nice. And I do think actually my comments are gonna segue nicely from Veronica's and also President Boric of Chile, who mentioned NIMBYism in his talk, which was fantastic. I spend a lot of time hating NIMBYs. So I've studied housing principally and housing markets and the way they affect where people live in cities and have access to opportunities for a while. And I didn't start out, and only recently have I started worrying about local democracy. And so, and that's because I live in California, and it has nothing to do with Latin America. But I think that in the same way that the morning panel was lamenting the adoption of the presidential system in Latin America, I'm worried a little bit, it's not a concern yet, but if cities in Latin America adopt our system of local democracy vis-a-vis urban planning, it could be bad because our system of local democracy vis-a-vis urban planning is terrible. So I guess the way I would tell you what I'm thinking about is how do different institutional structures of local democracy channel people's preferences towards urban development in more or less equal ways, right? And how does that affect people's lives? Is something, it's something that's very challenging. The field of urban planning doesn't have a good answer for that question. And the history of the US in that regard is instructive, I think, for Latin America, where I think there's a bit of a Goldilocks, like we have way too much local democracy and there is way too little in most cities in Latin America. The history of the US, right? Once upon a time, we were doing terrible things in American cities from a top-down manner, urban renewal, freeways, destroying neighborhoods. And so there was this movement towards community empowerment and community control that was justified at that moment, but it's been taken too far, I think, at this point, and we have this system of homeowner cartels preventing housing from being built anywhere that is destroying the future for young people. So I think one of the challenges, if you think about the three functions of local government with respect to urban planning, you can think about the kind of preventing things from happening, kind of regulating the production of urban space, coordinating investments, and then investing and building things, right? And the problem is that there are a lot of incentives among local communities to say no to things. And that's kind of the way we channel their frustrations, is saying no to things. Right? And we don't have a structure for communities to spend tons of money investing in train systems or the things that cities need to grow. Also, the complexity of urban planning processes favors the affluent because they can understand it or they can hire people to understand it to get what they want. And also we tend to structure participatory efforts in a way that favors the affluent. So like I said, we don't know how to do it well. And I'll just say two examples. How much time? Like all of us, I could just keep on going.
You have 3 minutes.
Okay, great. So I'll just give two examples from Latin America that I think are interesting in kind of the rise of community involvement in planning. So one is from Colombia, Bogota, for example, right? In Colombia, the constitution of the 90s created all these mechanisms through which people can be more active. And you see the great benefits of this in terms of environmental, preventing environmental destructions. But also you can start to see things like recognizable things for US planners, right? So blocking the Peñalosas came back to office, he wanted to build more BRT systems, and affluent community groups blocked his efforts, right? So there's these blocking of planning interventions that may or may not be good, and maybe in this case it's still like there was a worthwhile move to block that. But then once you get to this point where you empower the vetoes, you empower the voice of everybody that wants to say no to things, you can create a situation. I'm not saying that it's there yet, but you can create a situation like we have in the US, which is definitely bad for inequality. In Mexico City, there's similar examples of partial plans being this kind of neighborhood planning instrument that's very exciting for planners. It's like a detailed regulatory framework that applies to one neighborhood. There's a great paper by Sergio Montero on the Colombian case of the rise of judicialism in planning. And there's a great book chapter. If you want, you can email me. I'll send it to you. There's a great book chapter by Lidia Gonzalez Maragon about the Mexico City planning history and the partial plans. So there's 26 partial plans in Mexico City. I think 24 of them are in the 24 most affluent neighborhoods. And what do? They prevent anything from being built in Coyoacán and Polanco and stuff, right? So like the rise of these tools for participation tends to be, not surprisingly, taken over by affluent communities to preserve their status in society. So yeah, that's what I thought I'd talk about. I'd be curious to hear what y'all's thoughts. I mean, I'm not saying like don't do democracy at all. Democracy sounds great, but like there is a world where it goes, there's too much.
Yeah, democracy is messy.
Thank you, Paavo. Thank you for sticking to the time limit. So now we go from the environment to urban planning and urban planning participation to migration and the participation and potential democratic participation of people who find themselves citizens who find themselves out of their national territories. And for that, we have Dr. Gaspar Rivera Salgado, who's a project director at the UCLA Labor Center. The center has a longer name, which we rarely use, but he is also the director of the Center for Mexican Studies, which is part of the UCLA Latin American Institute. Dr. Rivera Salgado teaches classes on work, labor, and social justice in the US and immigration issues. He also directs the Cross-Border Labor Solidarity Initiative. Gaspar.
Thank you, Rubén. And it's so hard to do this after President Boric, right? I mean, he's so charismatic, and that was so refreshing too.
Yeah.
And just to know that he's delivering his talk. He's a member of the Communist Party of Chile. It is in 1968. Another communist delivered a lecture here, Angela Davis. Only one lecture, and she was fired after that. So welcome back to the dissident voices, to Royce Hall. And I was very, thank you for the conversation about the environment. I'm just thinking this morning about the paradox. While the Summit of the American is taking place in Los Angeles, there's one of the largest caravans being organized by Central American immigrants that are already walking from the southern border of Mexico towards the north. And the early estimates are there are 5,000 people, and it is projected to grow up to 10,000 people walking up north. So this is interesting, and it's paradoxical because the discussion about immigration in this summit has been relegated to the last day, to the last minute, and who knows if we're gonna have the promise of the immigration declaration. That's still up in the works because Central American governments and the Mexican governments are not here. So to me, that is very telling about the limits of multilateralism, right? I think in my mind, I think about multilateralism has good intentions, but the limits are set by nationalistic sentiments. And we know that very well for the debate about immigration here in the United States. How we think about it is paradoxical because we have in Los Angeles the largest diasporic population from Latin America, the largest Mexican population abroad, the largest Guatemalan, Salvadoran, you name it, Vietnamese, Korean. We're connected to the world. And I think on the other hand, we have the reality that we tend to look at immigration from one lens, which is national security, right? And this really simplifies a very complicated issue. Not all immigrants and not all immigration flows are the same. That's one thing. For example, when we talk about the current flow of immigration to the United States, we tend to just homogenize different flows of migrants with different characteristics and different impacts. And I think what I've learned by working with immigrant organizations and immigrants as political activists is that they can help us redefine some of these intractable issues. So one of the things that two things. So I'll talk about the basic redefinition about citizenship when we talk about democracy. One of the core concepts is who's a citizen? What are the boundaries of the political community, of the members, who's in and who's out, and what kind of rights they're gonna have? And democracy as a political process to allocate power and resources, right? So who participates? So that's one. And the other one, I think, is how we think about the process of movement and how we can start redefining that, especially from the point of view of actors that have multiple loyalties. So if you're a Mexican migrant who has been here since before 1986, chances are that you became legalized with IRCA in 1986, that you are a citizen, that you travel back and forth, and that you have contributed to sending more than $50 billion of remittances in Mexico. But, and this is the thing, how do these immigrants view the process of immigration? Do they have anything to teach us by having multiple loyalties, moving beyond the nationalistic point of view? And I think the emergence of cosmopolitanism is a very useful concept. So on the one hand, there are countries in Latin America like Mexico, like Guatemala, like El Salvador, that have huge percentages of the populations abroad. In the case of Mexico, a country of 110 million people, 13 million of their citizens are here living in the United States. Just think about that. So when you become the president of Mexico, 10% of your citizenship lives abroad, especially in the United States. Well, if you want to develop a strong democratic process in Mexico, a strong democratic institutions, you have to include everybody. That's the definition of citizenship, right? That everybody should participate in the political process to have a voice and to have also representation, to have a seat at the table. So that is interesting because some countries have moved in that direction, recognizing dual citizenship, which, by the way, in the United States is kind of a debate, right? How are we going to have these citizens with multiple loyalties? You can become U.S. citizen, and that was a deliberate effort on the part of the Mexican government to allow their citizens to say, become U.S. citizen, and you can maintain your Mexican citizenship. A step farther was the engagement of Mexican Americans. Said, well, yes, thank you for that symbolic gesture, but we want full political rights. That means that we want to participate in the political process, not only by voting, but also having representation. And that opens up a can of worms for everybody, because we tend to view political participation as a zero-sum game, right? You either are loyal here or loyal there. And I think this political participation has opened up the possibility that if you have a stake on multiple bases, that can lessen conflict, I think. The second thing is, and in the last minute, I want to talk about how to redefine issues of migration. We tend to think of migration as a one-way process and to define it as a problem. So the next question is, a problem for whom? And it's interesting that in this process, immigrants have built coalitions, advocates have been coalitions that transcend national borders. And now the big debate is not only protecting the rights of immigrants, to really push for a declaration that this massive mobilization of people that have been forced out of the homeland is a humanitarian crisis. Of course, that is difficult for nation states, because as soon as you recognize that it's a humanitarian crisis, you have the moral and legal obligation to respond to it. But I think the other very interesting concept is the concept to the right to stay home and the right to realize your dreams, to have economic opportunities, to have safety, and to have a future in your home. And I think that means that we need an entire transformation of the countries of origin. So this means a recognition on the sending countries that some things are not working, but also recognition of the countries that are receiving these immigrants, like the United States, like Mexico, to respond in different ways. So maybe we can discuss some of this during our follow-up discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaspar. The last presenter on this panel is Professor Segura. He's the Dean and Professor at the UCLA Luskin School for Public Affairs. Professor Segura's work focuses on issues of political representation and social cleavages, the domestic politics of wartime public opinion, and the politics of America's growing Latino minority. Gary.
First, thank you for inviting us. Second, thank you for the patience to stay here till the bitter end. And third, I'm grateful for the opportunity to remind myself that I was a professor and am a professor and used to write and think about these things. No, I still write and think about these things just very, very intermittently. I want to focus in many ways on the same questions that Gaspar was asking and answering. I probably come to somewhat different conclusions, but in many ways, the things I want to say flow directly from both what he had to say and actually what the previous speakers, Paavo and Veronica and Susanna, had to say. International migration is a permanent facet of the Western Hemisphere and indeed the entire globe. It has created large, enduring communities of national expatriates and even subnational and local geography concentrations in the United States. The co-location of large national origin communities like Cubans and Venezuelans and Dominicans, to say nothing of the Mexican population in the United States, means that there are really interesting political and political theoretical questions about what constitutes a polity and what the boundaries are of a political community which would exercise sovereignty over itself and its future. So thinking about these large external communities, we have to understand that migrants in the United States not only reshape the destiny of American society and politics, but they also reshape the destiny and the society and politics of their home countries from which they came, sometimes to their detriment, sometimes in a positive way. And I think we want to think about that in a very sober and honest way. Let's talk about different aspects of that. The first I want to talk about is citizens abroad voting in national elections, which Gaspar just mentioned, principally Mexico, but this is actually a feature of a number of Latin American societies. The Dominican Republic, for example, has had external voting for quite some time.
French Guiana.
I don't know how many French Guyanese there are in the United States, but it is not unreasonable to ask whether leaving the country forfeits your right to influence over events and institutions by which the voter, whether he or she is living in Southgate or South Chicago or Philadelphia, are not really affected by those outcomes. So we think about the place at the table. But why should you have a place at the table to determine the provision of goods and services to communities that you do not live in? It's a really interesting question about whether or not that's democratic, small d. As the numbers get larger, the influence of these communities, possibly to the point of being determinative of outcomes, will grow. There's the other question, which Gaspar made reference to, which is, does transnational political participation invigorate or eviscerate participation in US politics? Clearly, we would all believe that Latinos in the United States are better served if they participate in American elections and try to exercise some influence over the destiny and over the provision of goods and services and schooling and whatnot that affect the communities in which they live. It turns out, at least the data analysis that I've done in a number of articles that I've published, that they're positively correlated, which is certainly good news. So the more you're involved in home country politics, the more you tend to be involved in US politics. That relationship is almost certainly not causal. There are basically just two kinds of people in the world. There are political people and there are not political people, and political people are involved in politics everywhere. And most of them teach at UCLA. It raises another set of questions, and this: what constitutes a polity? Are nations organic, or are they defined by their physical boundaries? This is true when we think about the nation, when we think about what the electorate would be, and you need to be careful how you answer them. Because if we believe that nationhood and membership in a polity extends to points after migration out, then at least in the minds of some thinkers, not necessarily people I would agree with, but some thinkers, your status as an alien, as a non-member of a society, extends after migration in. And so I don't think we want to get in the business of creating permanent outs and permanent ins that are divorced from the physical location in which you are receiving your schooling, in which your tax dollars are paving roads and so forth. The second thing I want to talk about is remittances. Now, remittances are hugely important, and the numbers are extraordinary to the material well-being of many individuals and families in Latin America at the familial level. But structural remittance policies, which reward communities with matching funds, where local and regional governments incentivize the receipt of remittances from abroad by matching those with the expenditure of state dollars, are profoundly perverse. This is the state exporting its sovereign responsibility to people who live outside of its borders. Communities are actually rewarded for exporting their labor. I don't think we want to be in that business. And government becomes less accountable for local outcomes. Let me give you an example. In the literature on hometown associations, there's a Zacatecan hometown association, which is resident of all places in New York City. They built the municipal water supply. And if you build a new house in this community and you would like to be connected to the municipal water supply, you have to write away to New York City for permission to do that. That is not democracy by any definition with which I am familiar. That the provision of the key resource that's provided by government in any society in this small town is governed in New York City. These economic relationships have upsides, there's no question. The upside for US Latinos could be agency at home and the ability to reshape and reform and improve communities of origin for many family members who are still there. And so it's clearly important. The downside is the extraordinary forfeiture of capital by those Latino migrants living in the United States. Building a house in your hometown in Mexico to which you aspire to return, although they mostly never do, might be dream fulfilling, but having a house where you actually live might be more valuable in the long run to the security of your children and your family. Also, if investment in building new community resources in these donor communities means disinvestment and disinterest in securing the same resources in the communities in which you and your children actually live and go to school and recreate, that's bad. The last thing I want to talk about is the international migration of trauma. It is very clear to say that the experience in home country, the political experience in home country, clearly affects how those immigrants to the United States from those countries behave once they become incorporated into our political system. And you need to look no thought further than the Venezuelan population in South Florida. South Florida was a competitive state through the Gore-Bush, remember, many of you are too young for that, but the Gore-Bush recount and all in 2000. It's trending increasingly conservatively, and one of the reasons for that is a Venezuelan community that has largely been ignored by the Republican Party and its leadership are overwhelmingly Republican because of the trauma that they carry from their aversion to the Chavez and Maduro regimes, which are shaping the lens through which they view US politics. Bernie Sanders is an iconoclast, but he is not Hugo Chavez. But to the Venezuelans on Spanish Talk Radio in South Florida, he is portrayed as exactly that. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you very much. Well, I think that it's a good moment to turn it to the audience with questions for our presenters. And yes.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
I want to ask Gary a question. I thought that was fascinating. Can you be a member of multiple polities at the same time? I mean, my wife's from Tijuana. We go to Tijuana a lot. We're like a transporter family in some moments. I feel like you can have two. You can be committed to two places. Maybe 3 is too many. Maybe 4 is too many. How do you feel about it? Multiple polity membership?
So the leftist in me and the sort of transnational person in me says, sure, I feel an investment in more than one place. There's a difference from being a member of a community and a member of an electoral polity that determines policy. I believe you and your wife live in Culver City. should you determine municipal outcomes in Tijuana? I don't think so. I do believe you should have a vote in Culver City. But having a vote in both places, there are people who live in Tijuana. I think their voices should be larger than yours there. Then people want to say, well, wait, what if I own property in my hometown in Michoacan or whatever? We don't want political rights to follow the ownership of property. We did that once upon a time. That is not good. So what constitutes full membership becomes a really fuzzy topic. So nothing against you anyway, or Culver City.
Excellent, thank you, Gary. Our colleague here, Professor Wright.
Peter Rich from law school. Really great presentations, and one comment on environmental issues and one question on migration. Comment on environmental is I do a lot of work on water, international water law, and one of the trends I'm sure people have seen is this giving legal personality to natural objects. And so in the Bolivian constitution, the Ecuadorian constitution, and I've just been reading some cases in Colombia, but they're really talking about the right to sue on a forest or a river. And this was something that's been rejected by the United States. Justice Douglas had a dissent in Sierra Club versus Morton case where he said, well, we should give legal rights to natural objects, but that the majority rejected that. But that seems to be a trend in a number of places, which I think is it's a way of giving personality not only to these objects, but also to indigenous people who think about natural objects in that way. So sort of a comment. My question on migration is that in a way, a lot of migrants are sort of doubly deprived in their state of exception, because if you're let's say you come from Latin Mexico, Latin American country, you come to the United States, you are often, depending on your status, not getting any benefits in the United States, but you are paying taxes in the United States, which are becoming a huge windfall to the US government because you don't have a social security number, so you can't get them back. The taxes you paid in your country of origin, you're not getting anything for either. So you're really doubling you're really a citizen of no power in a financial sense. So I'm wondering if there's a lot of the migration issues throughout Latin America, if this is similarly the case. If you go from Venezuela to Colombia, and you pay taxes in Venezuela, you're not getting anything from Venezuela. You often don't have any rights in Colombia. This is a kind of multilateral problem for which there doesn't seem to be a solution right now, based on political will. It's not that there aren't legal doctrines which would apply to this, right? Legal doctrine says this is the benefit conferred. I confer a benefit, I have a right to recoup it. That's classic common law, civil law. But politically, this doesn't seem to be very popular because this is a group of people that have really no political representation. And so I was involved in a project a number of years ago with MALDEF, the civil rights organization, to try to recoup some of this money for undocumented workers in the United States, but it essentially went nowhere. Because although it could be documented, there was nobody other than the people themselves who were recipients had any interest in pursuing it. So I'm just sort of wondering what people thought of any possibilities of that in that area.
Should we get a reaction from the environmental presenters on the
right to nature? You do it.
Yes.
So there's a couple of things do trees have standing. Of course, it's the famous articulation of this, and also there's the Princeton philosopher Fisher, I believe his name.
Singer.
Yes, thank you. Singer, Fisher, similar letter. In any case, what he made the argument about animal liberation many years ago, and it's just taken a long time. It's still extremely incomplete. But the question about animal rights and animal welfare, which was not even considered, has evolved over time. So in a certain sense, I think one can look at these as sort of moral statements, rhetorical statements, and epistemic statements about how to interact with these. The other thing is in these constitutional things, another element of that is bien vivir, living well. So there's the Pachamama, which is that she has rights of nature, and that there has to be another way of living that doesn't necessarily destroy this. So I think we can look at these as articulations of values, and that they are invoked in political cases time after time. And I think you'll see that too. There's also there's a rights of river somewhere in Texas and so on. And increasingly, this is starting to sort of integrate in. And I think the reason that it is one, the problems of environmental issues can't just be seen as anthropocentric. So that this is it's an expansion in a kind of legalistic and moral framework about where things stand. But I think that they become increasingly important, particularly as Veronica mentioned, as the role of judicial politics moves more firmly into the social politics. And so that then these start to become more important. And I will point out that Pablo Escobar's hippos have rights in the United States. Migrants, maybe not, but Escobar's hippos are seen as people. So,
Veronica.
Can I, is it correct to say that Ecuador has some of the strongest right to nature in the Constitution? So I mean, I agree with what Susanna is saying. It's really a normative framework and an epistemic framework, but you take the Ecuadorian case, which I believe, it's not totally my area, but it has one of the strongest in Latin America legally, and also, you know, some of the most extreme cases of extractive mining, conflicts over displacement of indigenous communities, and massive amounts of environmental degradation through all this. So that case alone, because I remember I recently was reading a book about this, and it's sort of like, oh, this is really a juxtaposition that to me just reinforced the fact that, you know, things can, non-living things can have legal rights, but the living things, particularly the people, the living people things, are the ones that do that, right? That matter, right? Like it matters, like politics matters. And I think that it's alarming when you have nationalist governments or other types of populist governments that come in and use the right to nature as a way to, you know, achieve a political legitimacy with certain communities and indigenous communities, while on the one hand and on the other hand, completely enact policies that are counter to the interests of that community. So I don't yet know of a case where the right to nature alone, without the other factors that are important in our political and social institutions, makes a difference.
There was a case in the Philippines where its excessive forest was saved. It was Philippines, but it was a similar provision. But you know, you're right. I mean, this is it's a conflict. And
at the end of the day, I mean, Latin America and many global South countries, but you know, Latin America, the problem isn't, for the most part, I mean, the Chilean constitution was the Pinochet constitution before it was reformed. That's an extreme example, but for the most part, the constitutions look great. The problem is not the constitutions. The problems aren't the laws. The problems are always about implementation and on the ground capacity to make politically challenging decisions about a whole range of welfare reforms. So I think the de facto de jure thing is always at the end of the day, you know, what can you accomplish on the ground, as opposed to the fact that a change in a legal standard or regulatory standard alone, that's just the beginning, you know, that's not the end. And then for the most part, it's easy, you know, polluters love the environmental laws and standards that they can influence because they just are planning to ignore them anyway, or just pay a fine and ignore it, no big deal. So that's the status quo.
Or you can put it in Jair Bolsonaro. I just want to make one more point, just a quick point, and then we turn it over to the migration question. I guess I want to refer to Bruno Latour's idea of actants, which is that our world is shaped not just by humans, but by non-human actors, as we all know, those of us who survived COVID and are sitting in this room, and that in general, and you know, we're now getting climate change, which is driven by non-human actors, but that it's complicated. And so in a certain sense, I think some of these rights to nature things represent a kind, you know, it's like an evolution in, let's say, the history of thought. And in some sense, you can argue that it goes back to earlier forms in which the world was, you know, the Gaia world of Bruno Latour, where the world is animated and made sacred in a bunch of ways that we don't do anymore and do not do to our own cost. So I think that I think we need to sort of see it not as like the rights of nature and that somehow a bunch of trees are going to, like, you know, in Macbeth are going to come marching into the courtroom, but rather that it starts to change the frame of reference.
As Paul, I'm sitting underneath the tree and soon they'll be suing me.
Let's turn it to this question about the dual or even more than multiple exclusions of migrants. You want to take that first?
Yeah, and I know we're short on time. So I think, how do we think about citizenship? Is it a scarce resource that needs to be curtailed and regulated, or is expansive changing? And I think let's try to think about that. I mean, we know the debate in the United States when a local school district attempt to expand participation by undocumented workers. Some people agree, some people don't agree. And the idea there is that, hey, you don't have documents, your kids come here, you have to have a say. When some of the Southeast cities here also allow for city council members to not have papers, that created a big. So it's like the debate is recognizable, and that's exactly the same debate that we're having at the local level in Mexico. Last month, I was at the Zacatecan Federation House in here in City of Terras. It's a federation of 62 hometown associations from Zacatecas. They're organizing right now, tonight, actually. They're organizing reception for the president of the Presidente del Tribunal Federal de Justicia Electoral, and they're going to talk about the law reform in Mexico about voting abroad. I mean, they're hosting that, and it's interesting to be in that place. I mean, it's full of people who are very much following politics on both sides of the border. They feel passionate about local issues. Nochistlán, a municipality in Zacatecas, and how the 3-for-1 program is run there. And actually, the setup is very interesting because immigrants push for representation, not only the federal government, the state government, the municipal government, but also a local committee and a participation on the sense of the part of immigrants. And the demand was transparency and accountability of local government. So that's interesting that in this, the design and implementation of that policy, they wanted to push for more participation. They actually wanted to say the people who are going to receive these, they have to drive the issue. I mean, this is transnational planning. How do you incorporate the different voices? And it's not perfect, of course. It's in the context of a lot of corruptions. It's in the context that political parties control representation and control a lot of access to the democratic process. So I think, and the other example is how, so I'm fascinated by what immigrants do on the ground. So the other fascinating debate is in indigenous communities. There's hundreds of Zapotec mixed communities, migrants here. And it's interesting to be in the field, in the highlands of Oaxaca, in the Zapotec immigrant communities, where the community assembles, and they don't run their community through political parties, which is different from Zacatecas, and they're voting for municipal presidents, and they're voting for a guy who has been in Los Angeles for 20 years. And these meetings happen in November, and on the 1st of January, this guy gets the letter in the mail. Congratulations, Mr. Garcia, you've been elected. And so the democratic process comes not only with rights, but with obligations. So it's not, it's a process that is fluid, and this is at the very local level. They're not saying just because you went away, you forfeit everything. Of course, it comes with obligations here, and there's a debate, and some people support it, some people don't like it. But I think at the very end is a very interesting redefinition of the boundaries of that political community. And my sense is that it changes. My sense that it's not rigid, and at the end is about political power and the power to organize, to redefine that.
Gary.
With respect to the reference to the numbers of dollars that undocumented immigrants pay into the U.S. tax system, it's shocking. And I've devoted most of the last 20 years of my life to the cause of immigration reform, if for no other reason than the raw deal that immigrants give in every way. And there's no question that the free flow of goods and services and dollars without the free flow of labor creates these
Thank you, Gary. And what it's not damaging is actually the fact that we've been able to complete our schedule more or less on time, despite all the ups and downs, and the amazing things, of course, that happened today, the amazing discussion in the morning, this amazing panel with great questions from everybody here. And so I'm going to thank again the organizers. I want to thank especially Alexandra Lehman over here who put so much work through, some health issues as well in the last few days. And she's here, but truly, Alexandra, you did put a lot of effort. Also, the staff of the Latin American Institute over here, Ari and Veronica, we have, as always, provided superb help and assistance. And in general, the Berkeley Center, who took the lead organizing today's events, Cal over here, the director of the Berkeley Center, and other partnering institutions, the Luskin School of Public Affairs, of course, and our partners in DC and in Atlanta, I believe. So this was actually a great event, and it's a side event of many other things that are happening in Los Angeles this week. So I'm sure we all are paying attention to developments on that front.
I also wanted to add, I wanted to thank the Berkeley Center interns
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.